Today, I'm going to be speaking with Jessie Singer, who is a journalist and also author of the book There Are No Accidents: The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster. Who profits and who pays the price? Jessie, great to have you on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
So, in the context of these, I'll start with something kind of micro, and then we'll go from there. There's often these stories of, there was an accident with a gun. Someone was shot. It was an accident. A guy accidentally shot his daughter while cleaning the gun or something like this. And we often will talk about on the show where, okay, yes, we sort of understand socially what the term accident means. Under the law, this is often called the negligent discharge of a firearm, and sometimes it is something that people are charged with, and it's considered a crime, at least in theory. But the term accident sometimes puts like a very particular spin, as it may be, on our understanding of sort of like what happened. You talk about this at the corporate and the industrial and other levels. Talk a little bit about what does it mean for something to be an accident in the context of law and our understanding of what took place to just kind of get us into the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky term in that sense because it means so many different things to so many different people, and then has this specific legal definition of the line between intentional violence and maybe an act of God. Someone who dies during a hurricane, for example,
Yep.
totally out of our control. And it is a way of, I found in the book, absolving certain people when things go wrong and punishing others. And so we see really different outcomes depending on who's shot in the case of an accidental discharge, who the victim is, and whose gun it was, and whether or not we want to put blame on them as a society. And this even breaks down to the smallest levels. Like if you look at people being killed by drivers in like jaywalking crashes,
Yes.
or like drunk driving crashes in particular, where someone's struck by a driver, the race of the victim correlates with sentence length. So that if the person struck by a drunk crossing the street by a drunk driver is black, the sentence length of the driver is significantly lower. So there isn't an area of so-called accidental death where, we're not seeing huge variations in how the term is understood to kind of equate for different punishments. And then since so many of these things are not individual acts of human error, but really predictable, preventable, systemic causes, we see the least culpability when it comes to the actual like corporate perpetrators of these crimes, and like how the make and model of a gun and the design of a gun and the way that the gun has not been regulated is actually the real problem here, rather than whether or not it went off when you were cleaning it.
There's this book I read a few months ago. I think it must be about 20 years old now. It's called Normal Accidents by a guy named Charles Perrow, I think is the pronunciation of his last name. And in the book, he talks about a lot of different areas. He talks about aircraft accidents. He talks about nuclear, all these different areas. And he kind of distinguishes what we might call like systemic accidents, which are in a sense predictable, where we might say, here is a system. Here are the tolerances. Here are the ways the system can fail. And we can sort of make a prediction as to how common these things will be. And it's not going to be zero. Almost certainly it's not going to be zero. And one of the really interesting things he writes about in the book is that as you add mechanisms to try to make a system more safe, the added complexity and the fact that you now have systems interacting can actually keep the odds of an accident, so-called, roughly the same, or sometimes even kind of increase them. We know that to some degree, these accidents are predictable in systems because actuaries in insurance, part of their job is to sort of like put a monetary value and a number on how likely are some of these things to happen. On the issue of predictability and preventable when it comes to industrial type stuff, we often will learn after the fact that industry knew about a lot of these risks very specifically, and they either minimized it, covered it up, whatever the case may be. What are the kind of counter pressures that the public can sort of exert, or the tools that exist, not after the fact to do a class action lawsuit or a mass tort, but in the lead up to these systems sometimes failing, and what, as you write about, also are predictable ways?
Absolutely, yeah. Perrow's like kind of one of the classics of this field, who really like gave us a framework for understanding. And one of the things I try to do in the book is take Perrow's basic ideas, this normal accident theory, and by which he didn't mean normal as in common, but predictable.
Yes.
The inevitable, consequence of our systems, and he meant that an accident is a thing that exists in four walls: a nuclear power plant, an oil tanker, this contained thing. But something I try and do is blow out that theory to look at the much larger systems we have that correlate directly to accidents. And that's income inequality, that's racism, that's corporate power, and a lack of union power. Because we talk about these things as random. And if it was true, then injury-related death would be randomly distributed across the country. But it isn't true. People of color, people living in poverty are most at risk. And what we see is that, most people who die in accidents don't die in Charles Perrow's accidents, a nuclear meltdown.
Right.
Ones and twos every day on our roads, in our homes, and in our workplaces. And so to answer like what the solution is, at the core of it is that these accidents where people of color and people living in poverty are most at risk are accidents where policy and infrastructure make the difference between life and death. So the safety of our homes, the safety of our roads, the safety of our workplaces. And that's where we see these huge disparities in accidental deaths. So to name one, Black people die in house fires at twice the rate of white people. Indigenous people are struck by cars at twice the rate of white people. So these aren't, matters of individual error. These are matters of different conditions that different people are facing. Whether or not your apartment is a fire trap, and whether or not your government is regulating your apartment and holding your landlord to account. And so the big picture answer is that, regulating corporate power and forcing policy to protect everyone universally, primarily through government regulation and access to the social safety net, will reduce the way that risk is currently unequally distributed across the U.S.
It seems there's also sort of like a psychological component. Like if we think about drug overdoses as an example, recently at his rallies, Donald Trump has been, too much praise from the audience, talking about we should do the death penalty for drug dealers. They do it in China, quick trial, 100% conviction rate, all sorts of authoritarian dystopian nightmares, but the crowd loves it and they cheer. And there is something about when there's an individual, here's the guy on the corner who gave me the drugs, versus here's a pharmaceutical company that uses sales reps to encourage the overprescription, which then you get from a doctor filled by a pharmacist. The personal blame seems much easier psychologically when it's the guy on the corner to some degree. And that's probably much to the delight of the big pharma companies and their lobbyists, right? Like that's a feature for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you often see, today from pharma companies, but throughout the history of accidental death, whenever there's a rise in one specific type of accidental death, you see corporations pushing these bad people stories.
Right.
And so, you see it directly. I'm going to quote one of the Purdue pharma leaders, who was like, the problem here early in the opioid epidemic is the criminal addicts, the abusers. They're the problem, not how we're marketing an addictive drug is non-addictive, but these individuals. And that is deeply comforting for us as people. We are comforted and feel permitted to move on from what seems like random tragedy when we can find a bad guy, because it's a way for us all to say, I wouldn't make those decisions. I'm not like that person. That person who died, that person who hurt someone, I'm nothing like them because they're bad. And when we define them as bad, we can see ourselves as good, as smarter, as someone who will do a little better under the same circumstances. And this ranges from, accidental death, where we really do see a stigmatized bad person, like a person who's addicted to drugs,
Yeah.
but also when, on the little ones, like a traffic crash or, a fire where a kid was playing with matches. Finding the bad person, blaming the parent, blaming the jaywalking pedestrian is a way for us all to say, it can't happen to me. I'd make better decisions. And we see throughout the history of accidental death, even all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, when workers were dying in untold numbers in factories and coal mines, we see industrialists pushing this idea of the accident-prone worker and this caricature and stereotype of a drunk immigrant who doesn't speak English, sloppy worker that was really the cause of this massive accidental death toll. And in fact, it was actually that the factories and the coal mines were incredibly dangerous. And we know this because when we start to regulate those factories and coal mines, accidental death on the job plummets.
Yeah. So speaking of that, I mean, I think it's not at all a one. It's an all of the above for me, not a one of these things. We have ways in which regulation can make things safer, whatever it is those things we're talking about are. There's also those who say, to different degrees, technology is going to dramatically improve these things. As we learn more about how to design roads, self-driving cars, you have all of these ideas that at some point technology is going to make a lot of things much safer. Technology in factories that is going to reduce injury, for example. The counter to that seems to be that the new technology allows the limits to be pushed for profit again. So like now you have sort of like the same amount of safety, but there's more profit and more productivity. And so you have to know kind of how to counterbalance that. But to what degree is it fair to believe that technology will be a factor in making the world safer?
So this is an old story, and there's always been huge advances in technology that have reduced the accidental death toll, but only under one condition, which is when they are regulated. And so if you look at technology like seatbelts, airbags, collapsible steering columns,
Yep.
these were in the car huge advances in safety, but only once they were regulated into every American automobile. And when they're not, when you have government regulatory agencies that are afraid to regulate, like NHTSA is today, we get into a situation where rich people survive and poor people die. So like fully autonomous driverless cars are a way off, but there's a wealth of life-saving technology that already exists, is tested and proven. Automatic emergency braking, intelligent assist speed governors that are regulated in other countries where accidental death is far lower. But we don't mandate them here. Cars are underregulated, so only the rich are protected. The rich pay for features that could save everyone's life if the government forced it. And we see the same thing, as far back as the Industrial Revolution. There were technologies, a few companies were putting them forth, but the overall death rates weren't falling because the government wasn't forcing corporations to account. And when that happened, we saw results.
Last thing I want to talk about, inevitably, one could imagine this kind of caricature of the overregulated nanny state where we take everything you and I are talking about to the absolute extreme, and science fiction movies are made about it, and it's all very, very scary. And to some degree, I'm like sort of joking about it, but also I think even people who are in favor of a stronger regulatory infrastructure would concede that there's some limit at which we say, well, here are some choices we simply allow people to make, but we want to limit the collateral damage that might be associated with those choices. So it's really a choice that only affects the person making the decision. How do we start to think about where on the slider we sort of put that pin between the idea of freedom and safety? Or do you think that that is not even a valid spectrum for discussion?
I think it is a notably new spectrum to discussion that I think we spend a little too much time on. I mean, we're talking about more than 200,000 people every year in the US that are dying completely preventable deaths. And those numbers are infinitely lower in other wealthy countries. The rate of accidental death is so much higher here because we have this rhetorical conversation about freedom. But when it comes down to it, I think the nanny state is wonderful if you don't want to die an early death. I mean, what's a nanny? It's someone that rich people pay to protect their children from death. We should all have that. Americans will respond to what our leaders promote. This country did not start to reject the protections of a benevolent government like on its own. It's a product of corporate propaganda sold through the mouthpiece of anti-government, anti-regulatory presidents, and that's been happening for decades. I don't think Americans want to die horrible, painful early deaths in the name of freedom. We just need politicians brave enough to protect people and to tell a better story than this anti-government, anti-regulatory propaganda that we've been sold.
Yeah, crying about a nanny state often is a way to kind of invalidate conversations about just reasonable regulations that should exist. It's sort of a way to kind of clamp down on debate. It's kind of similar to I'm offended. Oh well, okay, the conversation's over then, I guess. It's a similar cudgel in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it leaves us in this place where people die incredibly preventable deaths every day in ones and twos. And we all tell a story about personal responsibility and the fact that maybe they were bad people, even though they're simply protectable. We're not going to fix human error. We're not going to make people perfect. But there are so many ways we could protect them from harm that we are disregarding for a conversation about freedom in the nanny state and the need for personal responsibility.
Jessie, last thing, lowest hanging fruit in terms of preventable death that could be improved relatively simply or easily. We know what to do. What are the areas that people may or may not know about where the numbers are high and could be lowered dramatically?
It's true in every area of accidental death by simply empowering our regulatory agencies so people are better protected and reviving the social safety nets so people can afford to better protect themselves. You know, not drive an old car, take the most dangerous job, live in a fire trap apartment. And because accidental death is so broad, there are a million ways to do it in your community. You can advocate for traffic calming and public transit expansions because you're far less likely to die or to kill someone if you're riding the bus than you are if you're in your own car. You can fight for safe injection sites and the free distribution of naloxone, which directly, dramatically reduces accidental overdose deaths.
Mm-hmm.
Pushing for ADA accessibility like ramps and grab bars, you know, in your workplace and in your apartment building is going to reduce accidental death. Making sure fire safety regulations are on the books and enforced, sprinklers, self-closing doors, all this stuff, it doesn't, reduce the likelihood of you making a mistake or a kid playing with fire or someone not being a distracted driver. It just reduces the likelihood that it's going to kill anyone. It just protects people.
We have been talking with Jessie Singer, who is a journalist and also author of the book There Are No Accidents: The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price. Jessie, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, David.